Okay. You ready, right?
I'm ready.
All right, friends, here we are. I'm Clayton Pixton. We're here with Susan Easton Black, and we're talking about church history, focusing on the time of Joseph Smith. We might even call this Joseph Smith Impressions of a Prophet. Right, Susan?
Yeah, I think we could call it that.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you in just a minute why we're going to maybe call it that. But I'll kick things off, try to bring the spirit early, if I can presume to do so. This is a sweet hour of prayer. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, that calls me from a world of care and bids me at my Father's throne make all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul hath often found relief, and oft escaped the tempter's snare by thy return, sweet hour of prayer, and oft escaped the tempter's snare by thy return, sweet hour of prayer. That was sweet hour of prayer. You're welcome.
Oh, we need that for this class, for sure.
Yeah, you always started your classes with a hymn. I think wisely so, right? You probably had a reason for that, not just to stall.
I think so. You're right. It brings the spirit into it, right?
It does. So I hope, I hope a small measure of that. So before we start, maybe we'll just mention why we're thinking of calling it Joseph Smith Impressions of a Prophet. So there's this woman named Liz Lemon Swindle. She's an artist, a good artist. She's a member of the church, right? And she paints paintings of figures in church history. A lot of Joseph Smith, some Jesus
Smith.
Christ.
Kind of the premier painter, actually. Liz is the first painter that actually decided to take Joseph's life from beginning to end and not just do a picture of the first vision or Liberty Jail or the martyrdom, but actually a lot on his family and other main events in church history. And more than that, she's just a splendid person.
So, Susan, you're coming out with a new book with her. That book was, how many years ago did you do a book with her?
Years ago, we combined talents. She did the painting, I did the words, and we put together a book called Impressions of the Prophet Joseph Smith. And I think of all the books that I've done, it was the hit the market. People were standing in lines to get copies. I mean, it was just one of the most amazing things I had seen. And so years have come and gone. There's a couple of generations also have come and gone. And Liz and I were talking and decided, well, why don't we revisit this idea of doing Joseph Smith's Impressions of a Prophet? And since the book had come out, she has done 20, 30 new paintings on Joseph Smith. And we thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we were to capture all of this? And at the same time, you may recognize Liz as the official artist of The Chosen, a very popular television series you can find on Netflix and other places. But she is becoming a really premier artist also on Christ and taking his life from beginning to end also.
Cool, yeah. So since Susan's doing that book with her, and we happen to be doing this podcast on Joseph Smith as well, mostly, we decided to kind of let those two projects, I guess, cross-breed, you might say.
Right, combine together. In other words, in printed form, there's only so much you can say about the prophet Joseph Smith. But by combining these podcasts with the book, anyone that wants to know more about Joseph Smith, besides what they could see in an artist's picture book, I think these podcasts would be great.
Yeah. So We'll mention it some more in the future, but there you go.
Thanks.
Yeah, so last time we talked about the organization of the church.
Right, and missionaries heading out all over the place.
Yeah.
And today we're looking at Joseph gathers to Kirtland, Ohio, and get him tarred and feathered literally within the year of the time he had gathered. So I think the group will find it really interesting tonight. So we're gathering to Ohio and then tar and feathering of the prophet Joseph. And I think they'll think excitement, and then they'll go, "Are you kidding me? That happened to a prophet of God." So you have a smorgasbord of emotions tonight as we learn about it.
A warning, guys, it gets a little intense. The prophet was pretty near death, I think it's safe to say.
I think that is safe to say, actually.
Well, please take us away.
All right. So with that, we're actually going to start then in February of 1831. Joseph Smith had received a revelation from the Lord that it was time to gather all these people who had joined the church, whether they joined in New York or other states, and the place to gather was Kirtland, Ohio. Of all the Latter-day Saints on the move in 1831, the first Latter-day Saint family to arrive in Kirtland was the prophet Joseph Smith. And we'll recall from last time that he alighted from a sleigh and went right up to Newell K. Whitney, who is sweeping off some snow on the porch of his establishment. And Joseph said, "Thou art the man," and that Newell had prayed him here. And Joseph wants to know, what does Newell want of him? So the first we get then is Joseph arrives in Ohio in February of 1831.
And Susan, will you remind us kind of what brought him there and why the church ended up kind of settling in Kirtland, like why they moved from Palmyra or wherever else, why things moved there?
So last time we learned that the saints were in Palmyra, Colesville, and Fayette, New York, and the church was organized then in Fayette, New York. And once the church is organized, they began holding conferences. And today we know that conferences are held in October and April. But back then, conferences were held many different months. So 3 conferences were actually held in New York. And at one of the conferences, Joseph indicated to the saints it was time to gather. He'd received Section 38 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Lord said it was time to gather to a land of milk and honey. So if you've ever been to Ohio, perhaps you'd say, yep, now that is a good place to live. And I'm sure the people that live there feel that. And so the reason for the gathering has everything to do with the revelation. And for many of these early saints, very difficult, because it meant leaving family, friends that they would never see again. And you know how you have here's what I plan to do the rest of my life. I'm sure many of them planned that they would stay in Western New York or whatever it was, but the sacrifice was to gather with the promise there they would be endowed from heaven, and there they will then build a temple. So Joseph's the first.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Okay. So we pick him up then 2 months later. Arriving with Joseph, of course, will be his wife, Emma. And here's one of those Liz Lemon Swindle paintings. And you'd say, what happens 2 months after they arrive? And the answer is Emma gives birth to twins. And the twins will live only a few hours and will die. So we could say at this point, Emma has given birth to 3 children, yet she has no living children. All 3 of her first children then died. So very difficult for Joseph and Emma at this time in April. But what is so incredible about in the midst of their sadness, coming to see them will be a man named John Murdock. And here's a picture of John Murdock. His wife had given birth to twins about the very same time that Emma did. And the difference in the situation is that where Joseph and Emma's twins died, John Murdock's wife, Julia, she died in childbirth, and the twins lived. At that time, there was really no substitute for mother's milk. And so John Murdock, like men that faced that, would walk through the streets of whatever town they were in, and they were looking for what were called wet nurses, meaning women who could still nurse a baby for them. And it will be at this point that John Murdock learns of the great sorrow that Joseph and Emma face. And he does something I'm sure I couldn't have done. I don't know about you, Clayton, but he literally goes to see Joseph and Emma, and he gives them a gift like no other. I mean, nobody else in the church gave them this gift, but he actually gave Joseph and Emma his twins. The twins were already named. It's a boy and a girl. The boy was named Joseph Smith Murdock. John Murdock had been one of the early converts by those missionaries to the Lamanites that were heading off to Missouri and stopped in Kirtland. And then the little baby girl was named Julia Murdock Smith. And so Joseph and Emma, now we could look and say, well, they've had 5 children, and at long last, Joseph and Emma have babies to hold. Well, you'd say, what else is Joseph doing at that point? Joseph, recall, he translated the Book of Mormon. It's now published. And Joseph's got a new plan, and he wants to translate the Bible. And it's a most unusual translation. He's going to translate the Bible from English to English. And you'd say, well, what does that mean? And what he wants to do is to add in the plain and precious parts that were left out. And so he's working. And this time, instead of using Oliver Cowdery as a scribe, like he had used with the Book of Mormon, he selects a recent convert, another one that was baptized by the missionaries to the Lamanites. He selects Sidney Rigdon, who had been a Campbellite preacher there in the greater Kirtland area. He selects him to be the scribe. And so try and imagine, you've got these 2 men, Joseph wanting to translate, Sidney wanting to be the scribe, and Emma saying, I've got twins, help me. Nobody could relate to that better than you, Clayton, right?
I think I can. We have triplets. Have we mentioned that on here? I don't know.
I don't think you've mentioned triplets. So
we have
definitely
triplets.
use more than one hand, right?
Yeah.
So with that point, then we look and we'd say, but in the meantime, there are a lot of people that want to visit Joseph, right? And you'd say he has many visitors, including people that are saying to Joseph, what does the Lord want me to do? And your consistent message out of Kirtland is go on a mission, tell others the news. In other words, I need you to leave. I've got to translate. I've got kids to care for. And but then there are curiosity seekers too. And among the curiosity seekers is a man named Father John Johnson. Notice he isn't your average 23-year-old, right, who is joining the church. He's actually a very prosperous man, second most prosperous, in a place called Hiram, Ohio, which is about 30 miles from Kirtland. And you'd say for Father John Johnson, he owned this home, and he owned 350 acres, and he has a wife named Elsa Johnson, and he's curious about people talking about there's a prophet in Kirtland, and so he decides to be a visitor, like so many others, but perhaps as a protective shield, he takes with him his Methodist minister, Ezra Booth. In other words, whenever something bad is being said or I don't understand, come on, Ezra, jump in there so I can figure out what's going on. So they come to visit Joseph, and in the course of their visit, someone asked about, are there still miracles today? And Joseph says yes. And then as an object lesson, Elsa, who had had a lame arm, was indicated, hey, Elsa here, the wife of John Johnson, who's in her 50s, that she has a lame arm and she hasn't been able to use it for about a decade. And the question was, is there anybody that could heal that arm? And suddenly it's reported that Joseph Smith walks across the room and says to Elsa Johnson, "Woman, in the name of the Lord, I command you to be whole." Suddenly she raises her arm, great excitement. It goes from just talk to an instant belief in his calling as a prophet. And from there, we find that Elsa Johnson, Father John Johnson, Ezra Booth, will be baptized then in the Chagrin River that goes through Kirtland, Ohio. Now, after the baptisms, Elsa Johnson, her husband John, they return the 30 miles back to Kirtland, and Elsa celebrates by washing clothes. And obviously, I'm not related to Elsa. I don't think I would have ever celebrated by doing that, but perhaps now, with two good arms, she's ready to go to work. Well, they go back and they're telling the news. At this point, Ezra Booth, the Methodist minister, he joins the church. He's baptized. And when he asks what he is to do, he is called on a mission. And the place he's called on a mission is go back home to Hiram, Ohio, and be a missionary. So Ezra, he now goes back to Hiram, Ohio. And it used to be, back then, instead of knocking door to door, that you would always go to the schoolhouse first. And the schoolhouse on Sunday was the local church, if they hadn't been there long enough to build a church. So the schoolhouse on Sunday, you'd get one church would hold a meeting, you'd break, here comes the members of the next church, and so forth. So you'd cover all the churches in town would meet in the schoolhouse. What the missionaries would do, like in the case of Ezra Booth, they would say to the local pastor preacher, "You could give your speech this week, or I'd be willing to talk, and you can have the rebuttal." And they go, "Wow, okay." And so Ezra now spoke, and one of the groups that met then in the schoolhouse was a group called the Campbellites, formed by Alexander Campbell. And listening there, the local elder who gave permission to Ezra to speak to his congregation was named Simon Ryder. And Simon Ryder, he's a Campbellite. You'd say not only is he the leading elder in town, but he lives directly across the street from Father Johnson. And if you were to say who was the richest man as it relates to land acquisitions in Hiram, Ohio, it's Simon Ryder. In fact, as the years come and go, he builds he has a road made in front of his house, and that comes up to the door. It's kind of like a round one. And he had a carriage with fringe, and he hired a local artist to paint he and his wife coming up to their palatial estate. So Simon Ryder is very impressed with what he has heard, and Simon Ryder now heads to Kirtland, Ohio, to meet Joseph Smith and to see what this is all about. Well, when Simon Ryder comes to see Joseph Smith, what we're going to find is that he also will accept baptism. And he's baptized in the same Chagrin River as Ezra Booth, the Johnsons, and he, like Ezra Booth, asked Joseph, "What does the Lord want of me?" And the answer for him, he is to take the place of a 17-year-old that had been called on a mission that changed his mind. And suddenly Simon Ryder, who views himself as perhaps above the 17-year-old.
Way above that, yeah.
Yeah, way above that. I can do much more than that. Says to Joseph, "I want you to write me out my missionary license." Now, I'm hard put to say anything against Joseph, but boy, he could have really used a spell check. He needed something. But what he did was, when he spelled Simon Ryder's name, he spelled Simon's with an I and Ryder with an I. And Simon Ryder, then his conclusion was, if you can't spell my name, then how do I know that you're really a prophet? And the crazy thing, Simon's writer's name is still misspelled in the Doctrine and Covenants. So I'm sure the guy is still ticked.
Spelled with an I?
Yeah, there's still a problem. And you're like, we may never get it right for this guy. But Simon's writer now teams up with Ezra Booth, and they're going to be what we call our first apostates, meaning they're going to fight against the church. They're not going to just leave the church, but they fight.
You always got to be careful when somebody's pride is hurt. It seems like that gets
you, right?
So many people.
Yeah, so many
of us.
Yeah, many of us. We're just so prone to it. Well, all right. You'd say at the time that Simon's writer and Ezra Booth, who has served additional missions and expected that he would cross a river, he'd be able to take off his cloak, he could put it on the river, and that the river would instantly dry up, like, the Old Testament times, and people he blessed, he thought they'd be instantly healed. When it didn't happen, he becomes very angry. And he writes a series of 7 letters against Joseph Smith and the church. And it's so interesting. Even today, Clayton, you can look at anti-Mormon literature and then you trace it back, and you can find hints of it still yet in the 7 letters that Ezra Booth sent to the Ohio Star.
The same themes and
same things. They're just, vitriolic. Well, while this is going on, Father Johnson now sends out an invitation to Joseph and Emma and to Sidney saying, why don't you come stay with me in his home there in Hiram, Ohio? For Joseph Smith, he will accept that invitation. So notice, literally 8 months after he moved to Kirtland, Joseph decides to move with his wife. They're twins. And even Sidney Rigdon, there's going to be a place for him to move to the palatial house of Father John Johnson, because Father John Johnson, his kids are raised. He has room. And this will put Joseph out of the traffic where everybody is gathering to Kirtland, and will put him within a day's horseback ride that he could get to Kirtland, but puts him away so that he could continue translating and basically be less disturbed. And he's got even Elsa Johnson with now 2 good arms. They can help Emma with the children. So it all looks really good. And Joseph moves there on September 11th, 1831. Well, all right. While there was a translation room. And Joseph and Sidney will then spend hours in the room while Joseph continues to add the plain and precious parts that through scribal error, scribal tampering, had been removed from the Bible. In addition, we find that while they're on this property, that you can imagine, you get the John Johnson property, and that people are anxious to be close to the prophet Joseph. In other words, they've just come out of New York, and what is it? We're in Kirtland. Where's Joseph? Suddenly, they're knocking on Father Johnson's door and saying, would you mind if we just put up a lean-to in your front yard? And we'd like to live close. We want to be by Joseph, and can we put up a bowery? We'd like to have a place where we could be protected while Joseph spoke. We'd protected from the rain, sleet, hail kind of thing. And Father John Johnson, a nice guy. And he's now allowing his 350 acres to be like a place where the saints are gathering. They're not really building permanent homes, but little shanty homes. Try and imagine how well this goes when you've got across the street Simon's Rider, and the street between the Riders and the Johnson was called Riders Road. And Simon's Rider then looks across the street and he sees Shantytown. And he's like, no, I have moved to the, quote, Beverly Hills of Hiram, Ohio. And what is Father Johnson doing? He's allowing these people, you got all these people, they're they're listening, they're talking, they're having baptisms. And for Simon's writer, he's very upset as to what he sees going on. In the meantime, Joseph seems to find Hiram, Ohio, a place of great revelation to him. It isn't just a translation of the Bible, but we can trace in the Doctrine and Covenants 16 revelations that are now contained in our Doctrine and Covenants that happened while he's there in Hiram, Ohio. The most famous, of course, is section 76, right? And you get right there in that translation room, you see section 76. You've got, as the revelation is going on, you've got Joseph Smith saying to Sidney Rigdon, his scribe, "Hey, do you see this?" And Sidney goes, "I see it." And the other man you see with the long beard of Philo Dibble, he's in the room, but he's going, "See what? See what?" And, so Sidney says, "I see this." Joseph says, "I see this too." And it's all Doctrine and Covenant 76. And you get this Dibble. Philo Dibble is going, he doesn't see anything. And when it's over, Sidney Rigdon is exhausted from the vision and needs to lie down. At which point Philo Dibble goes to him and says to Joseph, "What's the matter with Sidney?" And Joseph said, "Oh, Sidney isn't as used to these things as I am now." In other words, Joseph has had many experiences with the Spirit, many experiences with revelation. And Sidney Rigdon is scribe, although he's been a minister of sorts in the Baptist church and a Campbellite. Wow, this is something new, and pretty exhausted. Well, the issue with becomes now very dramatic. Simon's writer returns to his old church. His church is none the wiser. Simon's writer is still the elder. And his baptism, a fluke, a bad day, right? And Sidney Rigdon had also been a Campbellite. And suddenly, Simon's writer decides he wants to debate the prophet Joseph about the falsities of, quote, Mormonism. And Joseph writes back via newspaper and declines the invitation, saying, "It wouldn't be fair if I debated you, Simon." But he suggests, "Why don't you debate my scribe, Sidney Rigdon?" In other words, you both have been Campbellite preachers, the head elder. Why don't you debate each other? And Simon's writer now, rather than walking across the street saying, "I accept," he now begins a barrage of newspaper articles in which he says, "I would debate Sidney, but he is," and then he lists all the bad words he could think of, where you go, it's the most gigantic run-on sentence. He's an ignoramus, he's stupid, he's this and that. And Sidney will write back to the newspaper and on until you get columns of, hey, there is just this hatred between the men, never stepping across the street, but it escalates through this newspaper debate. Finally,
I wonder if there's a lesson in that today, Susan. Do you think?
I think so. You just cross the street and say, "Come on." Could we work this
cross
out?
the street sometimes instead of? I bet there's a parallel today.
I gotta be. Well, okay. For Simon's writer, obviously he's stirred up about the debate and non-debate. But then adding to his woes is that rumors begin to circulate now in Hiram. One rumor is that Kirtland is not going to be the new gathering place. I mean, can't you tell the prophet's there? We've got Shantytown all surrounding Father John Johnson. So that's a big rumor, which of course is not true. The other rumor is that, that Johnson house is going to be the headquarters for the whole church. They're going to be right there across on Riders Road. And did you say, Simon, you're hired an artist to paint you and your wife in your buggy, And then there was another rumor that where the Johnson property and the Simons property met, kind of like a cul-de-sac, that there were plans that they were going to build a temple in Hiram. And at this point, Simon's writer has had it. At that time and still today, you're not going to be picked up or arrested because of, your thoughts, your feelings. It's pretty much everything's based on action. And at this point, Simon's writer's got a plan. And he concludes that the only way to rid his town, Hiram, and his street of Joseph Smith and the many followers who are now there is to allow mobs to rule. We've seen that in our time period in the United States. I was on Berkeley campus when there was the riots. I was down in Watts when there was the riots. And so we've seen mobs rule. Mob rule, never legal in the United States, but mob rule typically occurs when they don't think they can get justice by going through legal means. So as the mob rules, we now pick them up on a certain date. And as we do so, Simon's writer has now sent word out to all the little towns that surround Hiram, Ohio. And, it's Garrettsville, it's Shalersville, you name the ville, word goes out. And the word goes out on March 24th, 1832, meet me about midnight in the brickyard in Hiram. Now, brickyards were always on the edge of town. So the question is, how do you get, we can name about 60 men. How do you get 60 men leaving their house in the middle of the night? My husband would be hard put to take off and me not know, right?
Yeah, that'd be a trick.
Okay, it's got to be a trick. So how it used to be in Hiram, as well as all these towns as we're heading towards the west, it was thought that when the woman needed to use like a restroom facility, she had a little pot by her bed. And there were all these kind of stories, don't you let the woman out at night. That's when the criminals are roaming wild animals. But the man, he always did his business outside in the outhouse. And so how do you get men out of their houses about midnight? And the answer is the man just says to the women, I don't feel well. I think I got to go to the outhouse. Even though she may worry that he hasn't come back and he hasn't come back, she is not going to go out till daylight because of the kind of spooky stories that go around and have circulated about women who would dare do this. Now, a man that has a tendency towards mob rule, he would always take out to the outhouse and bury somewhere old clothes because you're going to want old clothes for what's about to happen. And so at the outhouse, he would then change, put on the old clothes, and then hurry quickly to be at the brickyard in Hiram, Ohio by midnight. Well, okay, so midnight, 60 men are there. Once they're there in the brickyard, the men, because mobs are about to rule, are about to cover themselves with black paint. If this were taking place in a southern community, Mason-Dixon line, men would put on white sheets, white hoods. We've all heard Ku Klux Klan, even precursors to it. But you'd say, what was the look of mob rule in the North? And it's always covering themselves with black paint. And the black paint was a mixture of water and gunpowder. So pitied the man that said, hey, I'm going to light up, ba-boom.
Yeah.
I personally don't think it's a very good disguise. I mean, I've been wearing makeup for years, blue, green, yellow. I mean, heck, Clayton, you know who it was, right? And so they covered themselves, with black paint, meaning their face, their hands. And once the black paint is on, they're ready to do the deed, believing they are in disguise. With black paint on, they now head to John Johnson's farmhouse. As they head to the farmhouse, most of the men will stay outside, but 12 men will now come through the front door. As they come through the front door, at this time, we find that Joseph and Emma are sleeping. Well, Emma's sleeping in the side room. And so we turn now to the side room. As we do so, we find that Joseph is up. And by the way, this is Liz's most famous painting sold the most during the time we were working on Impressions of the Prophet. But they're in this bedroom. One thing to show the wealth of Father Johnson, if you wanted to show wealth, you splashed your place in color. If you were poor, you had log cabin, you had clapboard house, you might whitewash it. But if you're well-to-do, you have colored, and you can see even on the floor, it looks like a checkerboard of red, blue, and green, and then the yellow. Okay, that was typical. For Joseph Smith, he had been walking the floor with a little boy, a twin. So it's Joseph Smith Murdock Smith, who's about 9 months old. Joseph is then laid down on the trundle bed, you see, pulled out from under the bed with Emma then at the top. At this point, men will now attack Joseph Smith. As they attack him, they pull on him. One man I wanted to feature was named Warren Waste. Warren Waste had been bragging in the saloon there in Hiram that he could take old Joe single-handed. Well, for him, as others are pulling on his hair and arms and so forth, they've got 12 men, Warren Waste happens to pull on Joseph's right leg, the one that had not been operated on. Joseph doesn't want to go out of the home with these men, and Joseph actually kicks Warren Waste in the face. The kick was so hard that Warren Waste will stumble out onto the front porch. Years later, he was asked, who do you think's the strongest man you've ever tangled with? And he goes, oh, that's easy, Joseph Smith, But the other men succeed and one man, Carnet Mason, pulled on Joseph's hair and pulled so hard that he pulled out part of his scalp. And years later, a diarist, Levi Hancock, a shorter man than Joseph, said, hey, Joseph, I'm writing a diary. I understand you're missing, part of your scalp part in the top of your head. And could you bend down? He goes, sure enough, I saw it. Okay, so Joseph is now taken outside onto the porch where Warren Waste now stands up. And he he's touched his face, his hands, face bleeding, facial wounds bleed a lot. He grabs Joseph by the neck and chokes him. And Joseph now loses consciousness. The other men now pull Warren Waste off Joseph. It wasn't that they didn't want Joseph dead. They had just planned how he would die.
And to be clear, this, and I didn't realize this from the beginning, but this was a plan to take his life.
Yes, this was a plan to take his life.
That didn't get totally carried out that way, but the plan was to take his life.
Right, and so these men didn't want Warren Waste. They didn't want Joseph choked. That was not how he was supposed to die. So what we're going to see is that they dragged him then from the house, and they take him about 60 yards from the house, at which point Joseph now sees Sidney Rigdon. And Sidney Rigdon had been out staying in one of those little shanty houses. And he sees Sidney Rigdon. He had been dragged where they held his feet, and his head was hitting the protrusions of an ice. It's March, it's freezing. And Joseph now sees this, and you get his first words to the mob. And he says, thinking that Sidney Rigdon is scribe then in the translation, the one that's just, gone through the Revelation, you see this, section 76. Joseph's first words to the mob was, you will spare my life. And they responded, call on your God for help, for we will show you none. They then stripped Joseph of his clothing. And then he is introduced to the man who the mob had planned would take Joseph's life. His name was Dr. Dennison. And I think it's so interesting. There was a Dr. Dennison who was there at the birth of Joseph Smith, and years later he kept a day book and he wrote, if I had known what this baby was to become, I would have smothered the cuss. And is it a coincidence that you get another Dr. Dennison did the original doctor move west? Is it family? But Dr. Dennison, the plan of the mob was that he would kill Joseph by literally cutting off his manhood. And you get the doctor, he's got a plan. He's got the knife in his hand, but his hand begins to shake and he drops the knife. It's obvious the mob had a plan, but perhaps Dr. Dennison was unsure he could carry out that part. And so he had in his pocket a vial of nitric acid. And the doctor's, secondary, perhaps even first plan, he now pushes the bottle of nitric acid in Joseph's mouth.
And what would that have done?
Oh, it would just burn you. I mean, I don't know if it's like, drinking Clorox, but it's just this amazing poison, burn. It would just be horrible death. And Joseph at this point keeps his teeth clenched. The doctor pushed so hard with this vial that it literally chipped out Joseph's front teeth. And from there on after, he never gets the teeth fixed until 1843 in Nauvoo. So when he spoke, he always had that S sound, like you think of little
whistle.
8-year-olds, all he want for Christmas
like
was
a
two front
lisp.
teeth. Yeah, where he'd have kind of a distinctive voice. But between the clenched teeth and the pushing on the doctor, suddenly the vial will drop. And the question is, what now? How are we going to get him? And suddenly you begin to hear words from the mob that Joseph will ultimately write. One phrase that was said was, they say, Simons, Simons. And the question is, where's the tar bucket? And notice who they're talking about. They're not talking about just some guy, one of the 60, but we all know who's Simons. I mean, how many people do we know named Simons? So
this brings up, Susan, kind of what question I've had this whole narrative, which is like, who makes up this mob? And in my mind, I'm thinking these aren't just thugs and people of no consequence in society. What can you tell us
respected
about
citizens, who have sneaked out of their house, and you'd say, here's this Simon's Ryder, rich guy in town, recognized elder of his church, no doubt. But all of a sudden he wants to, where's the tar bucket? And here's showing a tar bucket. Sometimes we think of tar, at least, I do, where you think of tar on a road, where you're driving a car and they say detour, and then if you don't, suddenly, you cited car, you got all this
black petroleum-based stuff.
Yeah. But what we're talking about is tar. It's pine tar. Think of Uncle Remus and the tar baby. And so if you had a log cabin, you always had a tar bucket outside because you would mix the pine tar with leaves and junk, and then you'd put it where there were holes to try and keep everything more tight. And so they want to know, where is the tar bucket? And suddenly you hear, 'tis where Simon's left it.
So did Joseph hear that, or where do we have that?
Yeah, so that's Joseph then writing.
His account, okay.
Yeah, where he goes, oh, wow, I can name at least one mobber. It's my neighbor across the street. And what I also think is interesting, Clayton, is that when Joseph is hurt, it's always someone who has entered baptismal waters at one point. And you're like, are you kidding me?
So for example, Simon's Ryder, who else?
You'd say Simon's Ryder. You get, well, as we talk about Liberty Jail, you'd say George Hinkle betrays him. And, and William Law when he get towards
W.W. Phelps.
Carthage. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I think that's a message to all of us. It's the ones who cause him this greatest harm are those that have entered and made a sacred covenant, and then they not only, leave, but they turn their heel and wish to harm a prophet of God.
And Joseph Smith has said, I'll get the words wrong, but something about how when the more light has entered, when you've had more light, the darkness is greater that enters you.
Yeah.
Those words are all wrong, but
Yeah.
they're said in
But-
various ways.
Yeah, but so interesting, right? I mean, we just got to guard ourselves. Well, okay, we come now to this tar and feathering. Tarring and feathering. So interesting. It began in England, where in England, if you're going to die by the crown, you could choose to be hung until dead, burned at the stake, or you could be tarred. And how they would tar someone is they put the pine tar in the mouth. You'd then swallow it, and it would form a large lump, and soon you suffocate. You just can't breathe. And so you didn't know really how someone died. You go, well, how do you think he died? Until you could look in the mouth and you could see the tar. And so tarring came to America literally with the Mayflower. And it was always used by mobs, never as legal in the United States. Notice you'd say many people were tarred in the United States. Southern abolitionists, wife beaters, but very few are tarred and feathered. And so once you put the tar in the mouth, if you hate the man, you want to mock what he stands for, you take the tar, which imagine how difficult that is to get that pine tar, but you take the tar, you splash it over the man's body, and you then split open a pillow, let the feathers fall, and the feathering is to show that you mock the man for what he stands for. So many tarred in the United States, a prophet of God tarred and feathered, to show that the men not only wanted him dead, but they wanted to mock him for what he had done.
It reminds me a little bit of crucifixion, right?
Yeah.
The mocking, and not only the killing, but the very public
Yeah, public display mocking.
Yeah.
Well, while people run to get the tar bucket, you'd say Joseph is now there and he's waiting with others. And he said that one man in the mob scratched me well. Now you can imagine almost any woman I know could really scratch the heck out of you, Clayton, right? But
I wanted to.
but you'd say, well, what about a man? Well, you'd say Southerners at this time, probably a transplant then to Ohio. You couldn't always tell by what a Southerner was wearing, whether he was well-to-do or not, whether he'd left his, estate with the columns and all of that. So what he wanted to do is that he wanted to shake your hand, and you could feel then the length of his fingernails. And if his fingernails were not long, you'd say, oh, he's like new wealth. It's not generational wealth. It's not huge inheritance. But if his fingernails, began to curl and were longer, then you'd say, this guy could really scratch me well. And so some man then, no doubt somebody of Southern extract, and I think it's always so interesting, it was the Southerners.
Because their slaves would do the work, correct?
Yeah, the slaves would do the work. And so you could tell by their palms of the hands, you couldn't feel the calluses, but the length of the fingernails would say, hey, I got all kinds of slaves in my field. I'm not scratching the dirt, but I can scratch you. And I think it's interesting that the Southerners were the ones that introduced shaking hands at church. Where you go, oh, great to see you, shaking hands. And
I'll never think about that the same now.
Never be the same. You look for the
Make
guy
sure my
that
hands
has,
are rough or something.
Yeah. If you have rough hands, you're a good guy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all right. After Joseph had been scratched, the scene now turns to that tar. And they will then take the tar, not only put it in his mouth, but splash his body with the tar and let the feathers go. Here's another look at that. So you'd say many artists have tried to display what was that tar and feathering. At this point, once Joseph has been tarred, we know that the last words that he hears are, the Mormons are coming. Now, I don't know, if you'd be nervous, the Mormons are coming now, we'd say, oh, helping hands, just serve, that's so great. But the Mormons are coming back then. We've got some loose cannons, just in Puerto Rockwell alone. And a mob always appears brave until they're going to be caught. And, once they're going to be caught, the answer is, I'm out of here. We've done the deed.
They said that same kind of thing at Carthage, right?
Right. It's the same kind of thing. Mormons are coming, and suddenly the mob moves it. So can you see the man hurrying to the brickyard, washing his face, then rushing to, his home, but stopping at the outhouse, changing his clothes, coming inside saying, oh, dear boy, what a night I've had at the outhouse. Can you take care of the kids in the morning? I like to sleep this one off. So, tar and feathering, Joseph then describes that after everybody is, he said, once he hears the Mormons are coming, Joseph loses consciousness. And when consciousness returns, the first thing he does is pull the tar out of his mouth. So it forms a ball. He pulls it out. He loses consciousness again. It returns. He now begins moving, but he's too weak to stand up, and so he's crawling. As he's crawling, we now turn to his wife, Emma. Emma, now, middle of the night, she is very, very concerned. Where's my husband? Where have they taken him? Obviously, with lights going on in the Johnson house, many of the females and others that were living in that little shanty area have come there with Emma, and she's on the porch. Joseph, as he's crawling towards the Johnson house. He can see Emma on the porch, and he calls to her. As he calls to her, Emma looks out amidst the shadows. She can see him covered with something. She assumes it's blood, and she faints dead away. 5'9", just boom, she's gone. The women take her inside. Joseph's hollering he wants a blanket. Eventually, a blanket is thrown off. Joseph grabs it, comes inside. How is the night spent? The answer is Joseph's then taken into the house. He's placed on a table. The men then spend the night scraping off the tar from his body. Now, we've all seen pictures of Joseph Smith where you get his hair kind of combed forward, where we'd say, hey, that looks pretty effeminate. I don't know any guy that does this, And you say, why is that? Well, some of the more severe scars were around his hairline. And so that's the evening, and now going into the morning of March 24th. What about the next day? It's Sunday. You realize I'd have an excuse not to go if it was me. Just the chipped tooth would keep me home, right? But, it's Sunday, and you'd say, hey, Joseph, what are you doing? Oh, hey. He says, I preached as usual. And you're like, that's amazing. Were some baptized that day? Sure, 3 more joined the church. Well, after that, by Monday morning, what's Joseph doing? And the answer is he goes to see his scribe, Sidney. As he goes to see his scribe, Sidney is living out in one of those little shanty houses. And recall that Sidney had been carried, they carried his feet, so his head had hit the protrusions of the ice. His head had been in a pool of blood. And as Joseph walks in to see how his scribe is doing, Sidney has him come close, and he says, go get my razor. And Joseph asks him, well, why do you want your razor? And Sidney's comment is, I want to kill my wife. Suddenly, the little wife's running out of the house. Joseph goes to get her. Joseph comes back in, and Joseph's now sitting there, and Sidney says, go get me my razor. And Joseph wants to know why, and he says, because I want to kill Joseph. Now, obviously, Sidney pretty delirious at this time, pretty out of his mind. It's interesting. Sidney, although a great speaker, I would love to have heard him speak, he never kind of really got everything back after that. And he suffered from fits and had not experienced that. It's not epileptic fits, but he suffered from laughing fits. And I think we've all seen this. I know at night I'm a kid, slumber party, and it's middle of the night and somebody says marshmallows, and I'm just laughing my head off. but it has nothing to do with what's said. It's just you're so exhausted. And for Sidney, laughter, he could start laughing until he's throwing up and very ill. So Sidney suffers greatly from this. But the person that obviously suffers the most will be Joseph's little son. So remember how Joseph was up taking care of his son. His son suffered from measles. His son has complications. That night, obviously, it's not like they were not unattended, but Emma's worried, where is Joseph? Joseph's gone. And you'd say, who's going to die? And attributed to the night of the tarring feathering of Joseph, it will be his young son, Joseph Smith Murdock Smith, which will mean that Joseph and Emma have had 4 children, and now they've got one child left, Julia. Well, okay. With that, how does the mob feel about Joseph having survived? Joseph had said on that Sunday that he was all scarified and defaced, but had preached as usual.
And have I heard correctly that some of the mob members may have been in that congregation that he preached to?
Yes, I think some, because you got the open air, some have questioned, did he show up at the schoolhouse? Latter-day Saints were the last congregation, or did he speak probably in the Bowery there at the Johnson farmhouse? And yes, there's some thought that some of the mob had been there and waiting to hear the announcement, horrible, horrible, last night mobs ruled and the prophet's dead. But that was not the case. Do
you think that they, sorry to interrupt again,
No,
do you think that they thought that they had got him, or they weren't sure, or they just had to abort?
I think they thought they got him. I mean, who survives tarring? I think they thought they had him and didn't need to stick around. But
he was unconscious, at least for part of it.
Right, at least unconscious, so you'd assume, hey, he's gone. But you'd say the mob, they didn't want Joseph just scarified and defaced. And so as word now comes that there will be more mob action, Joseph will flee from Hiram, Ohio. He will flee alone without his wife or child Julia, and he will flee all the way to Cincinnati and then eventually to Missouri. And he will write to Emma about what he wants her to do. As he writes to Emma, his message is he wants her to return to Kirtland. In other words, as great as it has been living with the Johnsons in a small farming community, you're going to be safer among many, many friends. In other words, you're safer with everybody knocking on the door. And where he wants Emma to go, he wants Emma to go to Newell K. Whitney's store. And you'd say, what's the busiest place in town? That's it. And thinks he wants her to take Julia and says, if you want to live in Julia, go to Newell K. Whitney's store. And so where Emma will live until Joseph gets back, and then subsequently thereafter, they will live on the second story of that Newell K. Whitney store, where we'll pick them up next time as we talk about Revelations and School of the Prophets at the store, Word of Wisdom, at the store. And never again will Joseph return to Hiram. I think as we end, our audience might be interested in what happens to Simon's rider, right? Is there justice in this life? And you'd say, probably not. But Simon's rider, he lived out his days in Hiram, Ohio. Continues to be rich, continues to have the palatial estate, continues to have a road named for him. It's still called Writer's Road today. There's actually a church there at the Hiram, Ohio campus that has a big stained glass window, and below it is his name in memory of Simon's rider. But what I find is interesting, I found a transcript of the funeral of Simon's rider. And his son wrote of the funeral that in the books of the Mormon Church in Utah, that it says that Simon's rider was the leader of the mob. And the son says, no, I remember that night. My father was very ill and spent the night in the outhouse.
Wow, really?
So you look and you're like, oh, right, like I'm going to fall for that. Well, I, for one, am very grateful that Joseph survived the tar and feathering because we have so much more to learn about his incredible life.
Well, thank you, Susan. It's quite a dramatic story. I think all you listeners will agree. And have to think that he was protected, right? I mean, if the devil had his way, I'm sure he would have been taken that night. I always think about how, we're protected. Seems like the adversary would, if he could, he would take certain of us out, certain people out, and there must be certain laws and things and other protections that the good side plays a role in. Don't know how that works, of course, but just some random thoughts. Well, I think I'll end with
we need this sweet hour of prayer, right?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we do.
And I'm going to answer, if anybody's wondering, can I hear any of those hymns on Spotify or anything like that? The answer is some of them no, but some of them yes. Let me see if I can show you this screen. Okay, so this is an image if you're watching. If you're not, don't crash. But this is an image of a CD that I released years ago of hymn arrangements. It's called Hymns Anew, and it's got some great little arrangements on there. So yeah, and I'm working on some other stuff. As a matter of fact, I just released, this is not a hymn CD, but I just released some of my original songs. It's called I Try, and you can just look for my name on Spotify or whatever if you're curious. So there you go. Okay, here we go. So this is Sweet Hour of Prayer, second verse. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, thy wings shall my petition bear. To him whose truth and faithfulness engage the waiting soul to bless. And since he bids me seek his face, believe his word and trust his grace, I'll cast on him my every care and wait for thee, sweet hour of prayer. I'll cast on him my every care and wait for thee, sweet hour of prayer.
Beautiful.
Thank you. All right, guys, we're all the way to Kirtland. We got places to go, people to see, though. We're going to Independence. Where else are we going?
I'll go to Far West,
Far West.
Carthage. Yep.
Yeah, all that. So we will see you. Any last words? I don't want to take all the talking. You're just going to say thank you for listening.
I am going to say thanks for listening, and thanks, Clayton. What a great opportunity.
You're welcome, and I thank you as well. All right, guys, we'll see you next time right here. Goodbye. Okay.
Clayton, I love that sweet hour of prayer.